It was the kind of winter that turns the edges of Spokane County brittle. Deer Park woke to lawns salted white, breath clouding in the air, tires making that slow, careful grind over frost. In a small tan house on East Crawford, Chanin Denise Starbuck, 42, should have been doing what she always did, checking in with her 5 kids, juggling work, and keeping a life together after a marriage that had come apart. Instead, by the first days of December 2011, people who loved her were realizing something was wrong. Calls slid to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. A woman who never stayed quiet long wasn't answering at all. By then, the divorce from Clay Starbuck had a life of its own. Hearings, papers, and the daily arithmetic of shared custody. They had built a family of 5 children together, and now they were trying to manage the handoff of holidays and school weeks the way separated parents do when talk is tense and money's tight. Friends say Chanin was trying to start over, seeing people, meeting for lunch, sometimes keeping company with men she'd met online. She didn't hide it. She also didn't owe anyone an apology for wanting to feel wanted after years of coming second to fights and logistics. The push and pull around that new life, though, sat like static in the background of everything. Texts, checks on where the kids were, disagreements that didn't shut off at night. On Thursday, December 1st, Chanin's phone buzzed and chirped as it always did. Messages to and from men in her orbit, arrangements for lunch, light talk that sometimes tipped into flirting. Around midday, one string of messages suggested a meeting. Another excused a change of plans. People she had been chatting with thought she was out and about. In reality, no one can say with certainty when she walked through her front door for the last time. What's clearer is the gap that followed. Silence, the kind that stretches into a second day and makes you feel foolish for worrying until the worry itself becomes proof that you're right. By Saturday, December 3rd, alarms were set aside. Family and deputies met at the little house in Deer Park for a welfare check. The living room light worked, the heater hummed, nothing was broken. But halfway down the hallway, the normal world ended. Chanin lay on the bedroom floor. She had been strangled. Whoever killed her had posed her, an ugly staging meant to humiliate and to hint at a sexual assault that wasn't what it seemed. It's the kind of detail detectives say quietly, because how you handle a scene like that becomes the difference between truth and performance. The room was taped. The house became 2 places at once, a family home and a homicide. Detectives did what they always do first: slow down time and make the little things big. They mapped the room, fixed the body's position, and noted what wasn't there. They took Chanin's phone into evidence along with the cords and clothes and small items that make up a modern life. The first exam of her body told them more than enough about cause of death and the way the killer wanted the scene to look. This was intimate, controlled violence, not a brawl with a stranger who'd bolted through a window. It read like a person who belonged in the house or who knew it well enough to move without guessing. In those first hours, Clay walked into the picture because he was already standing in the frame. Detectives brought him in. As they would any ex-spouse in a domestic murder, he was measured, helpful. In that way people are, when they want to direct the search. He talked about Chanin's dating life, about phone sex and strangers in her messages, about laptops and numbers that might explain why she wasn't answering the door. He offered to show texts. He named names. To the investigators, it looked like a map, and maybe like a shove, toward other men, other possibilities. To Clay, it may have felt like clarifying context. To a detective who has read too many rooms like the one at East Crawford, it raised a different kind of question. Was this a helpful ex-husband, or the start of a story he wanted them to follow? The phone turned out to be its own character. Buried in those lines of bubbles and timestamps were calls and texts to multiple men, including one who, at first, wasn't even who he said he was in her contact list. Some messages went out at times that didn't fit, as if the phone had been used to keep up appearances for a while. When you read a dead woman's phone, you start to see the last hours in fragments only an investigator can stitch together. A noon text about lunch, a promise to swing by the bank, a later silence that feels like doors closing. It wasn't just the words, it was the pattern. Answers that looked like someone else had the phone in his hand for a stretch before setting it aside. While the lab started its slow work, detectives walked the timeline backward. The last person to see Chanin alive. The last person to hear her voice. Who had a key? Who could be inside without breaking anything? Where were the kids that day? Who was supposed to be doing pickup and drop-off? Holidays and shared custody always tighten the loop of opportunity. If you know when she'll be home, alone, and you know what doors stick and where she keeps her mail, you don't need brute force. You need a plan and a few minutes. Rumors ran fast in Deer Park. People talked about Chanin's social life the way small towns talk. Half curiosity, half judgment. Detectives did the work the rumors pretended to do. They identified the men in her messages, checked alibis, downloaded devices, and asked the same questions in different rooms because the truth usually says the same thing twice. They also worked the house again and again, taking swabs from everywhere a hand might have landed and pulling trace off her neck and fingernails. Early results pointed one unavoidable direction. There was DNA that connected to someone she knew all too well. There was also unknown male DNA on certain items and on her phone, a needle investigators would keep in the record as they built the larger case. The theory that emerged was simple in shape and complicated in proof. Someone used trust and schedule to get Chanin out of the house for a bit. Someone went in with a key or with the kind of quiet that suggests practice, hid, and then waited. When Chanin returned, there wasn't a break-in to worry about or a stranger to challenge. There was only a person who had once belonged in that space, moving toward her with hands set for one purpose. Afterward, that same person staged the room, manipulated the phone, and walked out carrying time. Enough of it to make calls, enough to toss or clean what needed tossing or cleaning, enough to show up somewhere else, looking like a man whose day had been ordinary. Back at the sheriff's office, it stopped being theory when the forensics started rhyming with the timeline and the phone. You can't convict on a vibe, and you can't build a case on one test. What you can do is stack the small, honest pieces where the children were that morning, when a text pinged, who had reason to be in that bedroom, which skin cells were on the skin you have to touch to kill that way. Prosecutors filed what the facts would support. Aggravated first-degree murder with aggravators that fit the life they could prove had been taken and the way it had been taken, and sexual violation of human remains for what the staging did after the fact. That is how a murder opens in Washington in winter. A welfare check in a quiet town. A bedroom that stops being a bedroom and becomes a scene. A phone full of plans that turned into evidence. And an ex-husband who kept stepping forward with details as if details could shift the heat. In the next part, we'll walk the investigation as it tightened. The interviews with the men in Chanin's messages, the cell phone trail that suggested spoofed texts and borrowed time. And the early hearings where a judge heard the first true shape of the state's case. For now, hold the picture that matters. Chanin, a mother of five trying to start again, found in her own home, and a town learning how fast an ordinary Thursday can turn into a story you never stop telling. In the first 48 hours after Chanin was found, detectives did what good detectives always do. They took the mess of a life interrupted and tried to turn it into a clock. Every ping, every swipe, every text had to sit on that clock somewhere. And when you lay a clean timeline over a dirty one, the lies tend to light up. They began with the men in Chanin's phone. Some she'd met for coffee, some only over messages. A few who had
A
tried
few
to
who had
become
tried to
regular
become
parts of her
regular
week.
parts of her week.
One,
One,
saved under a name
saved
that
under a
wasn't
name that
real,
wasn't real,
had enough
had
words
enough
attached
words
to him to
attached
look
to
like a
him to look
boyfriend
like a
on
boyfriend
paper
on paper
and a glitch in
and a glitch
practice.
in practice.
Detectives knocked on
Detectives
doors
knocked
from
on
Deer
doors
Park
from Deer
down into
Park down
Spokane
into
proper,
Spokane proper,
asked for
asked for
phones,
phones,
pulled call
pulled
records,
call records,
and compared
and
"I was
compared
at
"I
work"
was at work"
with
with
time-stamped gate
time-stamped
logs
gate logs
and
and
surveillance that
surveillance
didn't
that
blink.
didn't blink.
Most of those men
Most of
had
those men
lives
had
that stood
lives
up
that
when you
stood up
pushed
when you
them.
pushed them.
Security cameras
Security
put them
cameras put
miles
them
away when they
miles away
said they
when they
were.
said they were.
Work badges
Work
hummed
badges
through
hummed
readers
through
at the right
readers at the
minutes.
right minutes.
Wives, roommates, co-workers,
co-workers,
all the
all
mundane
the mundane
confirmations that make
confirmations that
alibis
make
boring,
alibis boring.
checked out.
Checked out.
The field of
The field of
suspects thinned,
suspects thinned,
and what was
and
left
what was
wasn't a
left
stranger
wasn't a
at all.
stranger at all.
Two things
Two
tightened the
things tightened the
focus.
focus.
The first was
The
the
first
scene
was the
itself,
scene itself,
a staged
a staged
humiliation
humiliation
meant to point the
meant to point the
investigation towards
investigation
sex
towards
and
sex
away from
and away from
familiarity.
familiarity.
That kind of
That kind
posing
of
doesn't
posing
feel like
doesn't
panic.
feel like panic.
It feels like a
It
person
feels
who
like a
knows the
person who
house
knows the
and
house
knows the
and
woman,
knows the woman.
someone both cruel and deliberate.
and deliberate.
The second
The
was the
second
phone
was the
trail.
phone trail.
On the day
On the
Chanin
day
almost
Chanin
certainly
almost
died,
certainly
her device
died,
kept
her device
talking,
kept talking.
little bursts of
Little
life
bursts of life
after there shouldn't have
after
been
there
any.
shouldn't have been any.
A few
A
friendly,
few
running
friendly,
late
running
texts
late
went out.
texts went out.
A plan or two
A
got
plan or
nudged
two
into
got
tomorrow.
nudged into tomorrow.
On paper it
On
said
paper it
she was
said
still moving.
she was still moving.
On the timeline,
On the
it looked like
timeline,
someone
it looked
trying
like
to keep
someone
up
trying to keep up
long enough
appearances
to
long
create the
enough to
illusion of
create
a
the
window
illusion of a window
in which something terrible
could
have been done
by
someone
someone
else.
else.
Digital forensics
gave those instincts a spine.
Pull the raw data
Pull the raw
off a phone,
data off
and you
a
learn a
phone,
lot
and you
about
learn
a
a
day.
lot about a day.
Pull the records from
cell towers,
and you learn where
and you
that
learn
day
where
happened.
that day happened.
The pattern that emerged was blunt. Messages sent as Chanin, when she was likely already dead, were consistent with a phone being handled by someone other than her. The phrasing shifted just enough. Punctuation, odd capitalizations, the way she said yes and no. The cadence of a familiar voice had gone missing, even as the words tried to wear that voice like a mask. And when detectives set those texts beside the cell site records and Wi-Fi connections, they found more discomfort. Communications that looked like they came from near places Clay knew, at times that fit his custody and errand routines, not hers. While the lab worked, the interviews with Clay Starbuck deepened. On day one, he'd been the earnest ex-husband pointing police toward Chanin's sex life. Names, numbers, laptop logins. The suggestion that there were a lot of men to look at. He said he worried about the strangers she met. He said he had tried to keep the kids steady while their mother, in his telling, got reckless. By day 3, detectives had walked his schedule so many times that the gaps started to echo. He had reason to be in the house recently. He had keys. He'd handled the exchange of kids and groceries and mail enough to move in those rooms without thinking. He wasn't a burglar breaking in at midnight. He was someone whose presence didn't set off alarms. Then there was the DNA. The first round of swabs from Chanin's neck, jawline, and fingernails produced a mixture detectives expected and one they didn't. The expected part was Clay's profile, present where the killer's hands had needed to be. The unexpected part was unknown male DNA in trace amounts on a few items and on the phone, a whisper that the defense would later try to amplify into a chorus. Investigators didn't pretend the unknown wasn't there. They placed it in context. Chanin had been dating. Her house was not a lab. Transfer is a real thing. But the weight of the biology, where Clay's DNA was and how it got there, fit the method of death too neatly to ignore. You don't leave your skin on a neck and undernails by dropping off a pizza. By the end of that first week, the clock on the wall and the clock in the data were almost the same. Morning routines about children and school runs matched what everyone remembered. A midday gap where the killer would have needed privacy appeared and stayed put. The "I'm fine" texts that tried to keep Friday and Saturday breathing as if nothing happened were now pinned to towers and routers that didn't belong to Chanin's day. And when detectives asked Clay about certain hours and certain keystrokes in certain accounts, His answers grew stranger. A lot of concern about who Chanin had been seeing, and very little about what only he could explain. The presence of his biology, exactly where it would be expected if he had strangled her. There were other anchors. Neighbors remembered the rhythm of cars. A camera at a nearby business caught a vehicle shaped like Clay's at a time when it shouldn't have been there if his story were true. Texts that claimed Chanin was out on a date and would talk tomorrow were time-stamped, then compared against cell site handoffs that told a different story about whose pockets certain phones were in. Even small things started to talk. A door that stuck for everyone but people who had lived there. A switch flipped the way Clay flipped switches, not the way Chanin did. Alone, none of those pieces would convince a jury. Together, they were a map whose legend pointed one direction. Detectives also did the hard, unglamorous work the rumors demanded. They found the man behind the fake name in Chanin's contacts. They checked his timeline. They built his day from ATM cameras, receipts, and the dull witness of timesheets. He didn't break. They tracked down coffee dates and one-time dinners. They read their phones too, with warrants stacked in neat piles so a judge could see the reason for every intrusion. They found exactly what you'd expect in the devices of grown adults trying to begin again. Banter, flirting, awkward jokes. Plans that sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. They didn't find a killer there. They found normalcy that had been used as a decoy. By the second week of December, the sheriff's office had stopped talking in maybes internally. Externally, the language stayed careful. You don't show your whole case at a podium. Privately, they began to draft an affidavit in the flat, steady tone judges expect. Chanin Denise Starbuck, last verified alive on the afternoon of December 1st, found deceased December 3rd, cause of death manual strangulation. Body staged in a manner consistent with post-mortem sexual degradation. Phone activity after likely time of death inconsistent with her known patterns. Messages sent as Chanin traced to locations and devices associated with Clay Starbuck. DNA consistent with Clay under the victim's nails and on areas of the neck and jaw. Additional minor male DNA of limited probative value detected on other items. Add to that a history of contention in the divorce, financial pressures, fights about custody, and the mundane frictions that make homicide detectives suspicious when an ex-spouse is too eager to narrate the victim's sex life. They arrested Clay quietly. No cuffs on a front lawn, no evening news show. He was booked on aggravated first-degree murder and sexual violation of human remains. The latter charge reflecting what had been done to Chanin's body after death to distort the investigation and degrade the woman it belonged to. He pled not guilty. His attorneys promised to show that the unknown DNA was the real story, that Chanin's online dates and casual contacts were a field of dangerous men, that Clay had become a convenient villain because the police wanted the simplest answer. As winter deepened, pre-trial hearings gave the public its first clear look at the skeleton of the state's case. Prosecutors didn't overplay. They walked the judge through the timeline that functioned like a ruler laid alongside the day, the phone analysis that caught the difference between Chanin's voice and the person pretending to be her, the tower records that put phones in the wrong places at the wrong times, the forensic lab reports that explained why the unknown DNA couldn't carry the weight the defense wanted it to, and the scene photos that, even in black and white, said what needed saying about posing, rage, and control. Through it all, 5 children were being shielded, as best a small community knows how to shield. School counselors wrote notes to teachers. Church friends picked up slack without fanfare. Holidays were remade with borrowed casseroles and quiet corners. The point of the investigation, underneath the paperwork and science, was simple. Tell the truth carefully enough that a jury would be able to carry it without dropping any piece. That's what the detectives owed Chanin, and it's what they owed the children whose lives had been bent by a December that wouldn't thaw. Trials don't fix what happened. They make it plain. When Clay Starbuck finally stood before a Spokane County jury in the spring of 2013, the two stories were simple to say and hard to prove. The defense said someone else, one of the men in Shannon's orbit, killed her, and that the case against Clay was a rush to the familiar suspect. The state said the room and the phone told the same story. A killing by someone who knew the house, staged to look like something it wasn't, followed by a digital impersonation meant to buy time. The prosecutor started where the case truly lived, inside the bedroom on East Crawford. Photos were clinical, cruel, and careful. Manual strangulation, no forced entry, a posed body meant to humiliate and to mislead investigators toward a sexual assault by a stranger. The pathologist walked jurors through the injuries and the absence of chaos, bruising and petechiae consistent with hands, not a ligature, close, intimate violence, no torn rooms, no ransacked drawers. This wasn't a fight gone sideways in the dark. It read like control from the first touch to the last insult of staging. Then the state turned to biology. Swabs from Shannon's neck and jawline and scrapings from under her fingernails showed a mixture, but not a mystery. Analysts testified that Clay's DNA was present in the very places a strangler's skin would slough off. That result sat beside trace amounts of unknown male DNA on other items and the phone. Jurors heard the difference between weighty evidence and background noise, how intimate contact at the time of death and defensive scratching leaves stronger, more probative profiles than the low-level transfer you can get from a life with kids, visitors, and dating. The state didn't ask jurors to ignore the unknown. It asked them to put it where it belonged in context. The digital forensics followed like a second autopsy, this time of a day. An expert mapped Shannon's device activity against cell tower handoffs, Wi-Fi connections, and her habitual texting style. The pattern was a metronome. Midday on December 1st, the communications you would expect from a woman moving through errands and plans. Then, after the estimated time of death, a string of short, "I'm fine," "running late" messages and deflections that kept her friends and dates at arm's length. The content was off by just enough: odd abbreviations, punctuation that wasn't hers, replies that didn't sound like the woman they knew. The locations behind those messages traced to places consistent with Clay's movements and the home networks he used, not the places Shannon would have been. The state's theory, plain and unnerving, was that someone used her phone as her for a short window to create the illusion that she was alive while he cleaned up and laid a false trail. Jurors also heard about injuries on Clay when detectives photographed him: small defects on his right hand and a mark on his forehead, the kind you can get when control meets resistance. Then came the testimony about keys, custody exchanges, and the silent knowledge of a house. Clay wasn't a burglar. He was a man who had belonged in those rooms for years. Doors that stick for visitors don't stick for you. That familiarity was the state's answer to why nothing was broken and everything looked both intimate and deliberate. The defense tried to stretch the unknown DNA into a parachute. They pointed to the men in Shannon's phone, to the flirtation and meetups, and to a particular contact saved under a false name, arguing that the state had overlooked a dangerous outsider. They suggested the posing and humiliation were the signature of a stranger, not an ex-husband. On cross-examination, they pressed the lab about contamination and mixtures, about thresholds and allele dropout, about how trace profiles can come from almost anywhere. They wanted jurors to feel the science as fog, but the men in the messages arrived with alibis that didn't wobble. Badge swipes, work logs, ATMs and cameras, families and co-workers who placed them miles away. And when the defense pushed the theory that the stranger's DNA should overwhelm the ex-husbands. If the stranger was the killer, the scientists pulled the conversation back to mechanics. Strangulation with hands is a contact sport. Neck skin and fingernails trap a killer's cells. Low-level DNA on a phone can reflect handling and transfer far from the moment of death. The jury didn't have to be lab-trained to grasp the difference. The detectives who had interviewed Clay laid out how his story shifted. At first, he was the ex-husband volunteering names and details about Chanin's sex life, trying, the state said, to give them a map away from himself. When the phone analysis landed, his focus on other men looked less like concern and more like deflection. He had keys. He had reason to be there. And there were gaps in his day that the state filled with the sequence the room and the phone agreed on. By the time the state rested, the case wasn't about any one spectacular exhibit. It was about fit. The bedroom read like familiar hands. The phone read like ventriloquism. The biology read like contact at the fatal moment. The unknowns looked like ordinary transfer in a life being lived. Not an alternate killer who, by some miracle, evaded every camera and task list while leaving the ex-husband's DNA exactly where the law expects to find a strangler's. In closing, prosecutors asked the jury to resist the temptation of mystery over math. You don't need to solve every fragment, they said. You need to decide whether the total, a posed scene, a faked digital afterlife, Clay's DNA where a killer's must be, injuries on his hand, no forced entry, and a motive seasoned by divorce and control adds up beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense asked jurors to live in the gaps, a dating life that offered other suspects, trace DNA that teased uncertainty, the possibility that police followed the easiest path. The judge's instructions were the law boiled down. Weigh each piece. Consider circumstantial evidence with the same care as direct. Do not let sympathy or speculation drive you. And remember that reasonable doubt is not a fanciful doubt. The jury took the case. They were out a day. When they returned, the clerk read the words that put the case into the record the way Deer Park had already lived it. Guilty of premeditated first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances and guilty of sexual violation of human remains. In the weeks that followed, jurors would hear victim impact statements and a judge would impose life in prison. And in the years that followed, appeals would argue over unknown DNA, over what evidence the defense could or could not show about other men, and over whether the phone's voice could be trusted to say who held it. But in that courtroom, on that afternoon, the story the room and the phone told together was the one the jurors chose to write into law. Verdicts tell you what. Sentencing tells you how much. In the weeks after the jury found Clay Starbuck guilty, premeditated first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances, plus sexual violation of human remains, the courtroom filled again, quieter this time. There is a different kind of stillness when the fight over facts is over and the law is about to count the cost. The state did not replay the evidence. That belonged to the trial. Instead, prosecutors asked the court to look squarely at harm. 5 children without their mother. A family that had to carry a picture of their loved one as she was found, not only as she had lived. A community made suspicious of its own ordinary days. A victim advocate read words that had been worked and reworked at a kitchen table until the sentences could stand up in a room like this. There were details you don't forget. Holidays rearranged around scars, teenage milestones met with someone missing, the way a house changes temperature when a person is taken from it. The defense spoke of history and humanity. A once intact family, years of work and fatherhood. The strain and bitterness of a divorce that had peeled the varnish off everyone's better self. They reminded the court that unknown male DNA had been detected in the case record, that alternative suspect questions were real even if the jury had not found them persuasive, that the line between explanation and excuse is thin but worth examining when a sentence will span a life. They asked the judge to leave room for the possibility that someday New testing or a new witness might shift understanding. Washington law leaves very little room when a jury finds aggravated first-degree murder. The punishment is life in prison. The judge spoke plainly. The court acknowledged the jury's careful work, the years of conflict that had formed the backdrop, and the brutality of what happened in a bedroom where ordinary had every right to expect to be safe. The sentence was imposed: life for the murder and a consecutive term for the sexual violation. A statutory recognition that what was done after death was itself a separate crime against the person and against the truth. A sentence does not end a case. It changes its shape. The record moved from trial counsel's hands to appellate lawyers who live among transcripts and standards of review. On appeal, the defense pressed the issues it had previewed at trial: that the jury should have heard more about the men in Shannon's phone, that the presence of unknown male DNA should have created more room for reasonable doubt, that the digital evidence, texts and calls, sent as if she were alive, could not by itself identify who held the phone at the crucial hours. Appellate courts do not retry facts. They ask whether the trial court abused its discretion or misapplied the law. The rulings that mattered most were, in spirit, about weight and balance. First, the unknown DNA. The defense wanted that whisper to become a shout. The state's answer, sustained by the trial court and later by the appellate review, was about context. Trace level, partial profiles on peripheral items are not the same as probative DNA on the neck and under nails, where a strangler's cells would be expected to be found. In a house where dating had been part of life, transfer and background are real. The law allows jurors to hear both facts and to assign them different weights. The jury did. The appellate court saw nothing unlawful in that assignment. Second, the alternative suspect evidence. The defense argued that limits placed on deep diving into the histories of Shannon's contacts constrained their ability to point the finger away from Clay. Courts walk a narrow path here. A defendant may present evidence that tends to connect someone else to the crime, but not invite the jury to speculate about any other person's capacity for wrongdoing based on character or innuendo. The trial judge permitted what the rules allow: alibis, phones, work logs, surveillance, the nuts and bolts of where were you when, and trimmed what the rules reject: rumor and volume for volume's sake. On review, that balance held. The jury had heard enough to consider another culprit. They had, after hearing it, chosen the state's map. Third, the digital trail. The appellate record affirmed what the trial made plain. No single text can identify a killer, but patterns can do what single points cannot. The cadence of messages that didn't sound like Shannon, the cell site and Wi-Fi locations inconsistent with her normal routes and consistent with Clay's. The timing of "I'm fine" notes sent after the likely time of death. Together, those elements were admissible and reasonably powerful. The phone did not testify to a name. It testified to a story, and jurors are allowed to decide whether that story fits the rest of the evidence. Appeals can take years. Meanwhile, life in Deer Park clicked forward. The children grew. Grief does not ask permission for that. And the community learned how to hold two truths at once: that the case was over for court purposes, and that it would never be over for the people who had to live with its wake. Reporters would, from time to time, revisit the file when post-conviction DNA conversations stirred. Requests for new testing with improved technology, petitions that argued newer methods might separate background from touch with more clarity. Those efforts are part of the system's promise to keep the door open a crack when science evolves. They do not by themselves erase a verdict. They ask, quietly and formally, "Are we still sure?" Through it all, one constant remains: the room and the phone still tell the same story they told at trial. A staged scene meant to degrade and misdirect. Hands where a killer's hands must be. Messages that tried to stand in for a voice that had been silenced. Sent long enough to buy an alibi's breathing room. The appellate courts did not bless those facts as cosmic truth. They blessed the process that allowed 12 people to weigh them, reject the defense's alternative, and decide. There is a difference between mystery and doubt. Mystery is what remains when you cannot answer every question. Doubt, in the legal sense, is what remains when you cannot answer the questions that matter. The law doesn't promise to drain a case of all mystery. It promises to demand proof beyond a reasonable doubt. On that measure, the verdict and sentence held, and the file moved to the shelf where finished cases live, available to be reopened if a genuine new fact arrives, available to be taught to younger detectives and lawyers as a lesson in how to read a room and a phone without letting the noise drown out the signal. When a case closes on paper, it opens in people. After the verdict and the appeals, Deer Park settled into the kind of remembering that doesn't make the news. It's the remembering done at kitchen tables, in school offices, outside church doors on cold Sundays. That's where Chanin Denise Starbuck lives now, in routines, in jokes that still land, in photos that were always meant to sit on mantles and not in exhibits. The law had decided who and what. The rest was the town's to carry. Her children learned how to grow around the missing shape, not away from it. Teachers kept a second calendar, the one that doesn't show up on lesson plans, the dates that might bruise, the holidays that require an extra chair in the counseling office, the weeks when a due date can turn into a reason to check in. Friends who were close enough to know her voice by its first syllable kept that voice in the room. They told stories out loud. The way Chanin texted too many emojis when she was excited. The way her laugh got louder when she stopped trying to make it smaller. The way she could turn a complicated day into a list, and then into a done list. The house on East Crawford changed hands because houses have to, eventually. New curtains went up. A different car learned to nose into the driveway's worn groove. The neighbors kept a kindness about it. No trivia, no tours, no rehearsals of the worst minute on the lawn. A place that had been a scene went back to being a home. In a way, that's the quiet victory communities can offer when the system has done its work. For the people who investigate violence, this case joined the shelf of files that become lessons. Detectives talk about it when they train newer hands on the two skills that feel modern and old at once, reading a room and reading a phone. A staged scene is a kind of story a killer tries to tell. You learn to strip the story down. The anatomy of manual strangulation, the absence of forced entry, the posing meant to humiliate and deflect. You learn not to be hypnotized by insult or props. You measure, swab, and map until the room speaks in measurements instead of in taunts. Phones, too, have their grammar. Investigators learn to listen for the accent in a text, the punctuation, the abbreviations, the way a person says okay when she means yes. They learn to trust patterns over single pings, towers and Wi-Fi, the difference between a home network and a drive-by connection, the way a life moves, and the lie that tries to imitate it. Impersonation by device sounds abstract until you put it next to a body and a timestamp. Then it becomes a clock you can teach a jury to read. The case also taught what to do with unknowns. There will almost always be a stray profile in a lived-in life, a trace on a phone, a low-level signal on an object that traveled through hands. The lesson isn't to ignore it, it's to weigh it, put it where it belongs, and no farther. The same discipline applies to alternative suspects. Run them down, all the way down, badge swipes, receipts, cameras, timelines, until the word else is no longer a fog, but a fact you can either stand on or set aside. Outside the profession, the town translated those lessons into ordinary caution. People who date learn to keep their safety habits simple and steady. Tell someone where you're going. Keep first meetings public. Trust the friend who says, "This doesn't sound like you." Know how to check your own account activity and recognize when a device is behaving like it's in the wrong hands. Families going through separations were reminded that the most dangerous time can be the time when everything looks temporarily calm. Friends learn to keep showing up even after the moving boxes are gone, because quiet is when fear has room to talk. Memory took on rituals with soft edges. On certain days, a park bench gathered fresh flowers without a note. A scholarship in Shanine's name helped someone else's daughter or son buy books and make a fall feel possible. A handful of friends kept a group message alive where they could drop the kind of everyday check-ins that don't need replies to matter. The point wasn't to build monuments. It was to keep her life threaded through other people's better days. Reporters circle back now and then, as reporters do, when a new case raises the same questions, or when technology offers to retest old evidence with finer tools. The file comes off the shelf. The language of appeals, testing, thresholds, transfer, returns to print. People ask, again, what it means to be sure. The honest answer is the same one the court gave. The process was careful, the proof was layered, the verdict was lawful. If science can someday draw an even sharper line between background and contact, the system has a way to hear that. Meanwhile, the room and the phone still harmonize. The story they sing is the one 12 people already believed. If you want a single sentence to carry out of this, make it simple and useful. Keep the victims at the center. In the retelling, say Shannon's name before anyone else's. In the teaching, let her life, not her last minutes, be the first paragraph. In the planning, remember that safety is not a speech, it's a practice of checking doors, of sharing plans, of trusting your own sense when a message reads in the wrong accent. There are other sentences worth keeping beside that one. Mystery is not the same as doubt. We will rarely know everything, and we do not need to know everything to know enough. Love is a schedule, rides, reminders, a casserole that shows up 2 months late and feels exactly on time. Grief is a long sport. You do not win it, you endure it together until enduring turns into living. So we end where Deer Park chose to begin again, with Shannon as more than a case. A mother of 5 who was trying, like so many, to build a second chapter out of ordinary pieces: work, messages, coffee with friends, new plans that didn't apologize for being new. The justice system did what it could. It named what happened and who did it, and it set the consequence in words that don't break. The rest belongs to the people who loved her and the town that learned from her loss, to live carefully, to tell the truth plainly, and to make sure the story that gets told most often is not about a man who staged a room, but about the woman whose life filled it. If you want true cases told with care and the victim at the center, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Comment for Shannon to honor her and share this episode responsibly. Your support helps us keep making thoughtful, respectful storytelling.